It began like any other ordinary morning, one of those days that blend into the next without asking for attention. The sky was the same dull gray, the air thick with the smell of coffee and impatience, and the building buzzed with routine movement. She arrived right on time, her steps steady, her mind already halfway into the tasks ahead. The line at the security gate was the usual mix of chatter and silence, the sound of zippers, ID tags, and beeping scanners filling the corridor. Nothing about that morning hinted that it would unfold any differently. She waited her turn, holding her tote bag close, the same one she carried every day, practical, worn at the edges, filled with the small pieces of her life. Inside were the things she thought about least: her phone charger tangled around a pen, a half-empty bottle of water, a folded grocery receipt, a notebook with pages full of notes that only made sense to her. She didn't think twice about any of it as she reached the gate. The security officers were familiar faces. She'd seen them 100 times before, exchanging the same polite nods that kept everything moving. The process was mechanical. Bag on the table. Step aside. Wait for the green light. The routine carried a strange comfort, like a rhythm everyone unconsciously followed. She smiled at the guard, who barely looked up before unzipping her bag. The sound was sharp in the morning quiet, the teeth of the zipper cutting through the hum of conversations. It should have been a quick glance, the kind that ends with a nod and a "you're good to go." But instead, the guard hesitated. His eyes shifted, narrowing for a fraction of a second. That small, almost imperceptible pause that signals something is about to change. She noticed it, but it didn't register as danger. Not yet. Around her, people continued to move through the line, unaware that the rhythm had broken. The officer started pulling things out of her bag one by one. Her phone, her keys, a small pouch, the notebook. Each item placed neatly on the table, as if being cataloged. Then came the silence. The kind that grows heavy and makes the air feel too still. The sergeant, who had been standing a few feet away, turned his head sharply, drawn by the guard's sudden stiffness. He approached, his boots echoing on the tile floor. She watched him without understanding what was happening, her thoughts scrambling to keep up. There was nothing unusual in her bag, nothing that should have caused even a flicker of concern. But the way the sergeant's expression changed told her that something had shifted. He leaned in, glanced inside, and then straightened, his voice cutting through the space with command. Asterisk, step away. Asterisk, the words were calm but cold, and they froze her in place. She looked around, confused, searching for context, for some reason that could explain this sudden attention. People in line stopped talking. Heads turned. The sound of the scanner beeped again, distant but sharp. It was in that split second that the ordinary morning cracked open. Every mundane detail, the buzz of the lights, the scrape of shoes on tile, the faint murmur of voices, became magnified. She could feel her pulse in her throat, the warmth of embarrassment creeping into her face, the sudden awareness of being watched. The officers were professional but tense, communicating with brief glances that seemed to exclude her entirely. Time felt distorted. Seconds stretched, and the calm rhythm of her morning routine was gone, replaced by a low hum of unease. She tried to speak, to ask what was wrong, but the words caught somewhere between her chest and her mouth. There was no space for questions, only obedience. The sergeant's tone had made sure of that. Behind her, the line grew longer, restless murmurs rippling through the crowd. She could sense the curiosity, the quiet judgment that comes when people don't know what's happening but assume the worst. The bag on the table, her bag, the simple one she'd carried for years, had become the center of attention, a silent object now treated like evidence. And in that moment, what had been just another morning began to feel like a test of something she couldn't name. A test of patience, of perception, of how quickly normal can turn into suspicion without warning. The ordinary rhythm of her life, the quiet predictability of routine, had been replaced by a scene that felt larger than it should have been. Everything she knew about being invisible, about blending in and moving through the world unnoticed, had been undone in a heartbeat. The moment stretched longer than it should have, a slow ripple of tension spreading through what had just been an ordinary queue. The hum of casual chatter fell away, replaced by a silence that didn't belong. The air shifted. She stood there, eyes moving from the sergeant to the guard, trying to read their faces, but neither gave her anything to hold on to. The guard's hand hovered over her bag as if afraid to touch it again, while the sergeant's voice had already drawn invisible lines of authority around her. Everything about his stance said control, feet planted, jaw tight, gaze locked. He didn't shout again, but he didn't need to. That first command was enough to change the room. The others waiting in line began to drift back, unsure but obedient to the tone of danger that had entered the space. Their eyes darted toward her, curious, wary, a few pretending not to look but unable to resist. She could feel their stares as clearly as if they were hands pressing against her back. Her bag sat open on the table, its contents half spilled, exposed under the fluorescent light. Something ordinary had turned into a spectacle. It wasn't about what was inside the bag anymore. It was about what everyone thought might be inside. The sergeant leaned forward slightly, his expression carved from suspicion. He didn't ask her anything. He didn't explain. He only signaled to another officer, who stepped closer, eyes sharp and movements measured. She wanted to ask what was happening, to clear whatever misunderstanding this was, but her voice didn't seem to belong to her. The words formed in her mind, but they stayed there, trapped under the weight of their silence. The sounds around her took on strange clarity. The radio static on one officer's shoulder, the faint squeak of rubber saws, the hum of the security gate scanning IDs that suddenly seemed miles away. It was as if the world had zoomed in on this single moment, amplifying everything that could make it heavier. Her pulse was loud in her ears, her breath uneven but quiet enough that no one would notice. She tried to remember every object in her bag, every possible reason for this reaction, but nothing made sense. It wasn't fear that took hold first. It was disbelief, a confused kind of shock that made the scene feel unreal. The sergeant exchanged a few short words with the guard, low, clipped, official. She caught none of it. Whatever was being discussed, she was excluded from it entirely, left standing in the role of the accused without ever knowing the charge. Around them, time thickened. A woman from the line whispered something to the person beside her. A man pulled out his phone, pretending to check messages while glancing up every few seconds. Every small movement fed the tension. Her instinct was to explain herself, to insist that there was nothing wrong, but the atmosphere around her made that impossible. Every breath, every twitch could be misread. She kept her hands still at her sides, forcing her face to stay calm, though inside, she felt the first flicker of panic. The sergeant gestured toward the open bag again, and the guard hesitated before reaching in, moving items with the careful precision of someone handling evidence. He lifted the notebook, flipped through it, frowned slightly at the messy handwriting inside. Then came the small pouch, the one she used for receipts and loose change. He opened it, looked inside, and paused again. That pause was enough to tighten the air a little more. She couldn't tell what he saw, or if it was even about what he saw anymore. Maybe it was the way he thought it looked. Maybe it was nothing but a misunderstanding caught under the wrong light. But in that moment, the situation no longer belonged to logic. It belonged to the unspoken power of authority and suspicion, a force that didn't need proof to justify its own tension. The sergeant's expression stayed unreadable. His eyes flicked from the bag to her face, holding her gaze just long enough to make her look away. That was when she realized that this wasn't just about an inspection. This was a shift in perception, the kind that changes how people see you in an instant. The others in line were still watching, their faces trying to make sense of the scene, to decide whether to feel pity or fear. The bag that had once carried the simple chaos of her life now felt foreign, like a trap she didn't set, but was standing inside of anyway. The guard began to repack the contents, slowly, methodically, but without the ease of routine. Every movement still carried caution. The sergeant stayed where he was, unmoving, his presence enough to hold the room in suspension. She could feel her throat tighten, her mind racing for context, for something to say that might dissolve this invisible wall of mistrust. The urge to speak battled with the instinct to stay silent, and silence won. Every second stretched thinner, louder. What had begun as a simple checkpoint had turned into a quiet standoff between uncertainty and control. The sergeant's eyes never left her. The guard's hands never stopped moving, and the crowd's curiosity hung thick in the air, turning the ordinary moment into something fragile and charged. The power imbalance was clear the moment the sergeant spoke. His voice didn't rise, but it didn't have to. The weight behind it came from the uniform, the badge, the authority that turned every word into command. She stood on the other side of that invisible line, unarmed in every way that mattered. No badge, no authority, just a bag that no longer felt like hers and eyes that could not look away. The scene had already defined who held control and who was meant to comply. He moved with the certainty of someone used to being obeyed. The guard mirrored his tone, adjusting his stance, adopting that same quiet stiffness that comes with following a superior's lead. She felt herself shrink in the presence of it, not because she was guilty of anything, but because the structure of authority demands submission even when you've done nothing wrong. There was no space for argument, no room for misunderstanding. Every gesture from them carried the same message. We decide what happens next. The table between them became more than a surface. It was a barrier. On one side stood the enforcers, on the other, the inspected. The fluorescent lights overhead threw a harsh glare on everything, exaggerating small details, the dull metal of the badge, the faint crease in the sergeant's brow, the tension in his jaw. Every inch of him communicated control. Every inch of her showed restraint. Her hands stayed still, fingers interlaced, the quiet posture of someone trying not to make things worse. When he finally spoke again, it wasn't a question, but an order. Don't touch the bag. His tone was even, almost polite, but it left no room for interpretation. She nodded once, too quickly, her throat too dry to respond aloud. He didn't look at her as he continued to direct the guard, who now handled her belongings with deliberate care, as if they might contain something dangerous. She watched as the small pieces of her daily life were examined. Her lipstick tube, her notebook, her folded receipts, all suddenly made suspicious by context. It struck her how little power she had to redefine the situation. It wasn't about facts anymore. It was about who got to speak and who didn't. The sergeant's silence carried authority. Her silence carried compliance. Even the air seemed to favor their side, thick with unspoken hierarchy. She realized that no one would ask what she thought. No one would consider how this felt. The moment had been claimed by procedure, by the script of power that repeated itself every day in 100 other small, unseen ways. The other officers stood a few feet away, their presence more symbolic than active. They didn't intervene, didn't question, didn't doubt. They were there to reinforce the structure, a living reminder that power, once established, is rarely questioned within its own ranks. Every movement followed a rhythm of control, a choreography that left her standing still while everything around her happened without her consent. The sergeant finally turned his attention back to her. "Where are you heading?" The question sounded ordinary, but it wasn't. It was a test, an opportunity for him to measure her reaction more than her answer. She responded quietly, giving the name of her department, her voice steadier than she felt. He nodded slightly, but didn't acknowledge it further. The hierarchy didn't require reassurance. It only required obedience. The space between them held more than distance. It held an understanding that wasn't spoken out loud. She knew she had to remain calm. Any show of frustration could be misread as defiance. Any attempt to explain could be seen as resistance. The safest thing to do was to stand still and let the process play out, even if it chipped away at her sense of dignity piece by piece. She could feel the imbalance not just in the room, but in her chest, where her breath came shallow and controlled. The sergeant's authority radiated outward, reshaping the atmosphere until even the spectators in line mirrored it. They stood quieter now, their curiosity dulled by caution. No one wanted to draw attention to themselves. The system that placed the sergeant above her also placed them below him, and they all seemed to understand that instinctively. Power didn't just flow downward. it spread sideways, demanding compliance from everyone who witnessed it. Every move he made seemed deliberate. When he finally gestured for the guard to step back, it wasn't out of kindness but command. The bag, still open, remained on the table as if waiting for a verdict. She stood waiting for permission to move, unsure if she was allowed to breathe freely yet. The imbalance had turned an ordinary security check into something ritualistic, a quiet performance of power and submission. In that moment, the sergeant didn't need to raise his voice or show aggression. The uniform was enough. The badge was enough. The silence was enough. Power didn't always shout. Sometimes it whispered and still filled every inch of the room. She could feel it pressing down, invisible but absolute, a reminder that at the security gate, trust was not shared equally, and authority did not have to explain itself. Judgment arrived before understanding did. It always does in moments like this. The way people looked at her changed so fast, it was almost physical. 1 second she was just another person in line, and the next she was the center of suspicion. No words had been exchanged, no evidence shown, but the atmosphere had already decided what to believe. She could feel it in their eyes, the quiet verdict forming without a single fact to stand on. The sergeant's stance, the guard's hesitation, the silence between commands. It was all enough to tell a story that didn't need truth to sound convincing. She stood frozen in the middle of it, aware of every movement around her, of how quickly perception could harden into assumption. The small crowd that had formed near the gate didn't speak, but their expressions said everything. Some looked cautious, some curious, a few even sympathetic, but all of them saw her through a lens that wasn't hers. She became a moment of intrigue, a disruption to their routine, a story to carry past the checkpoint when the day moved on. The whispers started low, not loud enough to be clear, but sharp enough to sting. Inside her, the urge to defend herself grew stronger than the fear. She wanted to speak, to explain that there was nothing wrong, to reclaim the narrative before it slipped too far from her hands. But every instinct told her not to move, not to speak too quickly, not to seem emotional. The power of judgment was that it didn't need reason, it just needed reaction. One wrong word could confirm what they were already thinking. One wrong gesture could make her look guilty of something she didn't even know she was accused of. She tried to hold her posture, steady and calm, though her body betrayed her. Her hands felt heavy, her breathing short, her heart quick and uneven. She could feel heat rising to her face, the kind that comes from being watched too closely for too long. Every second under those lights made her feel smaller, though she wasn't the one who had done anything. That was the cruel trick of judgment. It didn't matter what the truth was, only what it looked like. The sergeant's voice, calm and methodical, only made it worse. His every movement seemed to affirm that something was wrong, even if there wasn't. The way he instructed the guard, the way he lingered by her bag, the way he avoided eye contact, it all painted a picture of authority acting on suspicion. And once that picture was drawn, the crowd saw it as fact. She could feel the weight of their assumptions pressing against her skin, an invisible heaviness she couldn't shake off. Her mind ran through the contents of the bag again, trying to find anything that could have caused this reaction. Nothing came to her. Everything was harmless, ordinary, forgettable. Yet, in this space, even the ordinary could be twisted into something questionable. A notebook could look like a secret. A metal object could look like a threat. A woman standing too still could look like she was hiding something. Judgment didn't wait for context. It filled in its own blanks. A few people from the line moved farther away, subtle but noticeable. Their distance said more than words ever could. It wasn't fear of her, it was fear of being near whatever she represented now. To them, she was no longer just a colleague or stranger. She was the subject of an incident, and that label was enough to isolate her. The loneliness in that moment didn't come from being alone. It came from being seen differently, from realizing that a few seconds of misunderstanding could erase the person you were in their eyes. The sergeant gave a brief signal to one of the officers, who nodded and stepped closer. She caught the motion in her peripheral vision and felt the small tightening of space around her. It wasn't forceful, but it was enough to remind her of where she stood, under scrutiny, under power, under watch. She could sense how thin the line was between cooperation and confrontation, how fragile the idea of innocence felt when no one seemed to believe in it. Every time she met someone's eyes, they looked away quickly, pretending not to stare. But it was too late. The damage of perception was already done. People would remember this, even after it ended. They'd talk about the woman who got stopped at security, the one who made the sergeant shout, the one who made everyone step back. They wouldn't remember the truth, only the version that felt the most dramatic. That was how stories like this always spread, clean of facts, full of feeling. She stood there, still and quiet, the center of a misunderstanding that had grown legs and walked ahead of her. In their eyes, she wasn't herself anymore. She was whatever their assumptions allowed her to be. That was the real weight of judgment, not the accusation itself, but the way it reshapes the space around you, the way it strips away certainty, and the way it makes you question your own place in a moment you never asked to be part of. Courage, in that moment, wasn't loud or dramatic. It wasn't a shout or a protest. It was quieter, smaller, the kind of courage that hides in the simple act of staying still when every part of you wants to move. She felt her heartbeat climb into her throat, her palms damp, her body tense under the weight of all the eyes watching her. The instinct to run or explain herself pressed hard against her ribs, but she swallowed it. She stood where she was, her breath measured, her expression calm. That stillness was the only power she had left, the only thing she could control when everything else had been taken by authority and assumption. The sergeant's command still hung in the air, a trace of finality that silenced any thought of defiance. The officers moved with routine precision, the kind of practiced caution that made even normal actions feel accusatory. She kept her posture straight, careful not to look defensive or frightened, though both feelings burned beneath the surface. She understood that any flash of emotion, anger, fear, impatience, could be used against her. So she chose control. Every breath became deliberate, every gesture restrained. The courage was in the discipline, in refusing to let them see her unravel. Her eyes stayed focused on a single spot on the floor, a small scuff in the tile that grounded her while the world around her shifted. She listened to the murmur of voices, the rustle of papers, the shuffle of boots. It was strange how sound could become a kind of armor. Each familiar noise reminded her that time was still moving, that this moment, as humiliating as it was, would eventually pass. Courage was not believing she could stop it, it was believing she could survive it. The sergeant spoke again, short and calm, his words directed to the guard, not to her. She wanted to respond, to explain, to insist on reason, but she knew the power dynamic offered her no safe space for that. In this environment, every word would be measured, every tone interpreted. So she said nothing. Silence became her language, not out of fear, but out of wisdom. She knew that quiet composure would speak louder than any defense she could make. It wasn't easy. The silence from the crowd felt heavy, their gazes like invisible weights pressing against her skin. The urge to shrink, to disappear, clawed at her. Yet she stood her ground. Not defiantly, not proudly, but firmly. She reminded herself that she had done nothing wrong, that the truth would hold, even if no one else could see it yet. Courage, in that moment, was trusting her own calm when the world around her was built to make her doubt it. Her thoughts drifted to her family, to the people who would tell her later that she should have said something, done something, demanded an explanation. But they wouldn't understand the paralysis that comes when authority is watching you, when one wrong move could turn misunderstanding into escalation. Standing still wasn't weakness. It was strategy. It was survival wrapped in composure. The strength wasn't in action, it was in restraint. She focused on her breathing, the slow rise and fall that steadied her body even when her mind raced. Each inhale was a reminder that she was still in control of something, even if it was only herself. She could feel her pulse begin to slow, the adrenaline thinning, replaced by a steady kind of clarity. She didn't need to fight to prove innocence. The truth didn't need her to shout it into existence. It just needed her to endure until it surfaced on its own. The guard finally looked at her, briefly, eyes uncertain now, as if realizing that whatever they had expected to find wasn't there. The sergeant's voice came again, lower this time, issuing quiet instructions that she couldn't make out. She didn't ask questions. She didn't flinch. She stayed steady, her expression unreadable. That was her defense, not emotion, not justification, but balance. In a space where control belonged to others, she created her own version of it within herself. Even as the tension lingered, she refused to let humiliation take root. She wouldn't give them that victory. She held on to her poise like a lifeline, the same way someone might hold their breath underwater, waiting, trusting, knowing they would surface again. Courage wasn't about how she looked to others. It was about how she held herself together when no one else would give her the grace to do so. When the sergeant glanced up, his expression unreadable, she met his gaze without fear. Not challenging, just steady. A silent declaration that she would not be broken by a moment of doubt that wasn't hers to carry. The balance between submission and dignity was delicate, but she found it, standing right there in front of them. The courage was in that quiet defiance, the kind that didn't need to speak, didn't need to prove, didn't need to win. It only needed to endure. Perception is a fragile thing, built from fragments of what people think they see, shaped by fear, bias, or habit. In that room, perception had more power than truth. It decided who looked guilty, who looked trustworthy, who belonged, and who didn't. It didn't matter that her bag held nothing dangerous. What mattered was that, for a few tense moments, it looked like it might. That single pause, that moment of uncertainty from the guard, changed everything. The sergeant's command, the silence from the crowd, the nervous distance between strangers, all of it was born from perception, not fact. And once perception takes root, it doesn't care about correction. It feeds on assumption until the truth becomes almost irrelevant. She could feel the weight of it long after the search had ended. The memory of that morning wasn't about what they found. It was about what they thought they might find. The difference between innocence and suspicion had come down to appearance, to a few seconds of misinterpretation. It reminded her that people don't see with their eyes alone. They see through layers of expectation, prejudice, and fear. The uniform saw risk where there was none. The crowd saw guilt where there was only confusion. And she saw how quickly perception could shift, how suddenly a life could tilt because someone misread a moment. When the sergeant finally stepped back, his expression neutral again, it didn't feel like relief. It felt like survival. Even as he gave a small nod to indicate she could leave, she knew something had changed. The power imbalance lingered in the air, the kind that doesn't need words to remind you of its presence. People moved aside for her, but not out of courtesy, out of discomfort. Their glances carried traces of the story they had already built in their heads. Maybe they'd tell it later, maybe they wouldn't, but either way, the story would live on, detached from reality, reshaped by the limits of human perception. As she gathered her things, each motion deliberate, she could feel how perception reshaped her own sense of self. For a moment, she wasn't sure how she looked anymore. Was she the woman who had done nothing wrong, or the woman others believed might have? The mirror of perception reflected something unfamiliar. It showed her not who she was, but how easily her identity could be rewritten by others' fears. That realization was heavier than the event itself. She thought about the small things that might have contributed, the color of her bag, the look on her face, the way she held herself, maybe even the sound of her name when the guard asked for it. Perception doesn't need a reason to twist, it just needs an opening. She realized how fragile the line was between normalcy and suspicion, how thin the wall was between respect and doubt. Once someone decides you look out of place, it doesn't take much for the world to agree with them. As she walked through the gate, her footsteps echoing against the tile, she felt eyes follow her. Not all of them were hostile. Some were uncertain, some apologetic, some indifferent. But none of them were neutral. Neutrality doesn't exist once perception takes hold. Every gaze carried a story, each one slightly different, each one rewriting her in its own way. Some saw her as unlucky, others as suspicious, others as a lesson. To them, She was no longer just a woman passing through security. She was an event, a disruption, a moment to remember and repeat. Even later, when the building returned to its usual rhythm, the air around her still felt different. She carried that difference with her, the invisible mark that perception leaves behind. It wasn't something she could wash off or explain away. It stayed in the way people greeted her, the small hesitation before a smile, the careful tone in their voices. Perception had changed not just how they saw her, but how they interacted with her. The lesson wasn't about security or authority. It was about how fast stories form in silence. How quickly one action, one misunderstanding, can define someone in the eyes of others. She had watched it happen in real time. The transformation of her ordinary presence into something uncertain, then threatening, then cleared but still marked. It showed her how fragile fairness is when perception leads the way. She realized that most people don't mean harm when they misjudge someone. They just don't notice the harm they cause. They act on instinct, on the need to categorize, to protect, to make sense of what doesn't fit perfectly into expectation. But every time they do, they build a wall between what is seen and what is real. That wall had stood between her and the sergeant, between her and the crowd, between her and herself. As she left the checkpoint, she felt the air outside hit her skin, cold, sharp, alive. It was a reminder that perception doesn't end when the moment does. It follows, it lingers, it shapes the way people remember. And once it takes hold, it becomes a story that lives longer than the truth ever will.